Hi, Sue Hall and Tristan McDonald here with Talk the Dis Out of Dyslexia, August 12th, another podcast in the Whole Dyslexic Society's outreach initiative. I'm proud to call Manda Aufochs a dear friend. She's a remarkable mother, author, journalist, researcher, educator, broadcaster, activist who loves words and literacy and is bringing us an in-depth understanding of why phonic, phonemic, and phonetic approaches are just not our thing. Manda, it's so good to see you, and to introduce you is difficult because you sort of have had a lifetime in literacy and words and books and the written word, and so I know that you are the author of two books, one of which is The Green Mama, and I know that you run the Folk University on Cortes Island as part of a literacy project. I know you're an amazing researcher, but maybe you could fill us all in on the bits I've missed.
Thank you so much for having me, Sue. I feel like you summed it up pretty well. I think whenever a person is trying to tell the story of their own career, it's quite complicated. I will say that for me, the written language has always been very, very important. And perhaps in part, that's because I grew up in the States, quite poor, in a low-income family, and where neither my brother nor my sister graduated from high school. It was just not necessarily expected that I would have achievement in the written world. But nevertheless, I made my way to university, grad school, where I went to become a writer, in part because I was smart and recognized as smart in a really traditional way. And therefore, I feel that perhaps that's actually hindered my idea of literacy because it rewarded a particular kind of intelligence that is readily awarded in the world. My background is largely both in the environmental field as well as in writing about the environmental field. I have two books, both which are around environmental health issues, which I did a lot of research around and have published. And I've also published my own website for the last 13 years and have won lots of awards for that and have made my living primarily as a journalist and as a writer during those years. Art has been very important to me.
It really has. But when you discovered dyslexia, must have had something to do with your daughter, right?
Yeah, so I started getting interested in dyslexia and what that means because I have a daughter who is dyslexic. She is now 13 and a half, and she was about 9 when it became very, very clear that something was really different, and we finally got the label of dyslexia. But far earlier than that, even in her educational career, it was clear that something was going slightly different for her and her learning. Until that point, we had lots of other ideas or thoughts about how that might manifest or what the differences were. And it was always very, very clear that she was a bright, bright kid. And it just never even occurred to me that obviously bright child of two obviously bright parents who was read to and told stories with such abundance and who was so alive in her imagination and her, her processing abilities, that there was something different about her when it came to schooling. But then, over the years, by the time she was in halfway through grade 3, everybody else in her class was reading and she was not. And we, so like, I feel like, how do you make a long story short? I do not know, but she was 9 and a half when she finally came to USU. And I actually, before she came to you, we had an educational assessment done.
Oh, that's right.
And during the educational assessment, she was 9 and a half. It was determined that she could recognize 7 letters.
Wow.
That was the extent of it. She came out with a official diagnosis of having both a visual processing disorder, a phonological processing disorder, short-term memory issues, and some coding troubles, which is really exactly what they, is dyslexia in the world of the educational assessment.
Absolutely. I'm just going to jump in there with the visual processing and the auditory processing. Some people find it difficult to understand why we can have both. But the auditory processing is literally because we do not process auditorily. It's not in our wheelhouse. But the visual processing is often because we're not given enough images to process, which ties in with those little words, the trigger words that we know about. Does that make sense?
Yes. And I think that, what I have found is that most people have some vague sense of what dyslexia may be, and that largely they associate it with the visual processing aspect of dyslexia, and they can imagine what that means. And there's, even from my research, what I have found is that even if you go to a psychologist who specializes in learning differences or disabilities, if we are really still struggling with what is dyslexia and how narrowly are we going to define it, and whether or not you need to have the phonological, or whether that is necessarily part of it, or whether it is, whether it is mostly about this visual difference. And I have two children, one who does not have the psych ed evaluation, but in my experience is probably has the visual processing difference, but does not have so much of the phonological processing difference. And I have another child who very deeply has both of those. And there's a number of people who I read and follow who are psychologists who specialize in educational differences, who say that unless you have both, it is not really dyslexia. I don't think it really matters that we parse those, but what I do think matters is that we understand that when we're looking at what works, that those children who have both versus one will not necessarily behave to interventions in the same way.
Right.
And I think it actually explains why we see such a huge range of feedback on how successful different interventions are.
That's a really good point. Really good point. Just before we go too far down this road, Tristan, you had a question.
When you found out your daughter had dyslexia, before that, when you were approaching her to try and get her to learn something, what were you doing to try and teach her? And when you found out, what did you find worked after the fact that you found out she had dyslexia that could help her? Like, what were the methods that you had to do to kind of maybe even see that she was learning better when you approached her differently? What were the tactics?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's so many pieces in there for me to answer this. Because during this long period of time where we were going to school and sort of trying things and seeing if they could work, she was at 2 different schools and also homeschooled, which is one of the reasons that there was all this complexity, because it wasn't until there was year after year of us kind of trying and being able to compare her to other people getting similar education that it became really clear that something was really different, right? So I feel like that was part of the complexity, and it's also part of my answer, because I have found that, the difference between also homeschooling 2 kids who have really different learning needs is that my eldest, who is what they call doubly gifted, right, is very profoundly dyslexic. She doesn't do so well with the kind of nuance of like, oh, now your mother's going to teach you, now we're going to try this, now we're going to do that.
Right.
Like, she likes things to follow certain rhythms and patterns and to be as they seem. So one of the biggest things I would say that is a difference that I have very slowly come to learn is that, by and large, when I am trying to teach a child how to read, every school that I put her in, every tutor, most interventions, they wanted to teach her phonologically. They wanted to say C makes ka, A makes T makes ta, C that's cat. And what I've come to understand by going deeper into my understanding and my research about when someone has the phonological processing stuff on top of the visual stuff, her brain does not work that way. I can say 1,000,000 times ka 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 ka, c c, ka 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 ka, and there are so many steps that are moving around in her brain or not making those associations that I might as well be saying to a deaf person, ka 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 ka, that's C, ka a t, cat. Like it really is like that. It is like I am speaking to a deaf person over and over and trying to get her to make those associations. She does not.
And that's just who she is.
That's just who she is. And once I got over, needing it to be that way, and now I have two very different learners at home. With my other child, who has a lot of the visual processing stuff, she really has a lot of the crossing over things, letters and numbers going every which way. I see that she struggles with that in the visual world. But the difference is I could say to her, P makes ka, and she could hold on to that information and make sense of it. She could start applying it. So I feel like eventually, if I were pounding at that with her, she would get there. But I watched my eldest child have that pounded into her for probably close to 5 years in a school setting. And at the end of that, when she was 9.5 and finally went to Sue Hall, she, after a week and a half of all day with Sue Hall, she came to me and she said, "You'll never believe it, Mother. Did you know reading is just knowing letters and putting them together in words?" She's been in school for more than 5 years at this point. And she nobody had ever explained to her what this magic thing was that she saw happening all around. And so I think, part of it is just that, like, once we removed this idea of like continually going after the things that made no sense to her, all of a sudden she started learning.
And I have to say, of all the students that I've ever worked with, she has the most incredible recall of the models that she's made. So once we got into making, the three-dimensional models for the words that she needs to be able to recognize and spell, if I said to her, say we came across a word in her reading and it was through, for example, and I said to her, "I think we know this one. Can you imagine the model that you made for that?" Well, she'll see the model straight away and then she'll say through. And I have never, ever come across anybody who's able to recall all their models just as clearly as she can. It's remarkable.
Yeah.
So it's interesting that the challenge and the gift are both at the extremes.
That makes me feel very happy because, as a parent, when you see an obviously bright child that you have done everything, or that I, did everything right for, right? Like everything they tell you should do, from like good diet to low stimulation to, no screen time, hours and hours of reading, being read to, a great love of literature, like, working with them from an early age, there's not anything that was left that I didn't do. And so, the downside of that is then when something starts going wrong, I feel like there's so little pathway for that parent.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And even when, there's so, like we've had financial resources, we had a beautiful school that kind of was able to like love and appreciate her despite her differences. We had if we hadn't found Sue Hall, I actually do not know what we would have done, because of this sense of you have to put a huge amount of faith into a world that had, with very little pathway forward, because we just sort of see all the time the same things being told us as to what like should work, and when they don't, it feels quite scary.
Do you think that Sue's method of teaching, the Davis way of teaching, would be an advantage to have in everyday schools for both people who have dyslexia and not, considering you found that it helped your oldest daughter so much, that maybe if they would have it in these schools, your daughter wouldn't have had to gone through such a process of going, why don't I understand what you're putting in front of me? Why can't I grasp it? And then to have Sue's, I guess, resources in the schools, it'd be like a eureka moment, really. Do you think it'd be helpful?
I mean, absolutely. I mean, my eldest daughter no longer is in school, and in part because there's just no resources in almost any school for a child like that. And then my youngest daughter is in a class, and where she's also struggled to learn to read, and she is in school. Now that I really feel like I intimately know the Davis method, watching one child and now a second child work with it for years, I think that there is no child left behind with this method. Even if you have a quick ability to process things phonologically, so sounding out is easy for you, there are so many times in the English language where sounding out fails you, right? Like,
it does for me all the time.
Right. So if we knew that there was another way, and also I feel like that would be fantastic for students, but I really feel for the teachers, because I see how much they love these kids. My youngest daughter is in a class with 4 grades. 4 grades.
Whoa.
And I know how amazing it would be to work with 4 grades with the Davis method, because there's so much room for working together and for being at different levels. But how you begin to try to meet the needs of varying students and 4 different grade levels, I really feel for those teachers, and I think it's it's really, really hard, and I wish they had access to this information. And I think this is also like a good time to get into a little bit of some of the stuff that I did in my research.
Yes.
Because when I'm confused or overwhelmed, this is what I do. I like to look at the research. I like to look at the kind of detailed information. So that's what I did when I had a child who was so different. And I knew as a parent that she was smart, but trying to make sense of that or interpret that to the rest of the world who does not see someone who can't read smart.
And that's the biggest stigma behind it, right? The rest of society will look at you, basically, you're not smart or you're dumb. I definitely ran around feeling like that for the longest time, and then you get introduced to this and you go, oh, holy cow, you begin to go, what these people are saying about me or couldn't be further from the truth.
Yeah. And how are we supposed to advocate all the time for ourselves? It's not really fair, I feel like, for someone who has the difference to all the time be the one trying to come up with the solutions.
Exactly. Now, you did a lot of research into phonological and phonemic awareness, and what is phonics?
Yeah, so part of when I got this diagnosis that she had this phonological processing difference, that didn't really mean anything to me.
Yeah, that's fair enough.
I think most people, it's much easier for them to imagine and to associate the visual differences, right? And if you go online, actually, there's lots of places where you can be like, this is what it looks like to be dyslexic and that kind of thing. But people really, I find, kind of shy away from this phonological aspect. And why do they shy away from it? I assume because it is really hard to visualize.
Yeah.
Good point.
So part of what I did is I just started looking into to what the different things mean. And I have to refresh myself all the time, because there's 3 things. There's phonological awareness, phonemic, or being able to work with phonemes, which, am I even saying that right?
Yep, you are. Yep. Beautiful.
So there's phonological awareness, there's being able to work with phonemes or to understand what phonemes are, so phonemic awareness,
Yeah.
and then there's phonics.
Yeah.
And these things are all slightly different.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
So the way that I think about them, and that this could be slightly wrong because once again, I'm just a person, just a parent.
And it's not an easy subject, that's for sure.
It's not easy, and it gets back to why I feel for teachers, because these three things, we kind of throw them about as if they're one, but they're different. So phonological awareness is basically what they say, like on my eldest child's psychological educational assessment, they said, okay, she's got a phonological processing disorder. Mm-hmm. So phonological awareness is the broadest of the terms. Mm-hmm. And it refers largely, in my understanding, to the ability to hear, distinguish, and manipulate the sounds that make up the human language.
Okay.
So it really exists in the way that we hear and make sense of what we hear.
Got it.
Now versus phonemic awareness,
right,
it's more specific. It refers to the ability to hear and manipulate the fundamental units of oral language. So like rhyming is basically playing with phonemes. Am I saying it right?
Yeah.
Right? Ring, sing, ding. And if a child can hear that those rhyme, and if a child can start making an association with, say, S and ing, right, then we can get them to put together the basics of words through just that phonemic awareness, right? Sing, ring, ding. I'm playing with rhymings. I'm playing with these units of sound that I can put together in different ways and manipulate.
Yeah. So if you see CH, you know you're going to go ch, that type of thing.
Yes, but I think that it's also about being able to hear that there's a ch.
I got you.
And that a ch can go with an ing, and it's ching. And ching sounds like ring.
Got you. Okay.
Right.
And this is where I think we start going down, like the phonological part is really in the realm of just being able to hear and distinguish. And as it goes closer and closer to making sense and to the coding aspect, we're going down more into the phonemic awareness and then into phonics.
Right.
Now, phonics is the ability to apply the sounds of letters to decoding written language. Oh. So by the time we get to seeing something and hearing and connecting it to a sound, now we're getting into the realm of phonics.
Okay.
And phonics particularly likes one letter, one sound. But phonics starts to become phonemic awareness when it goes from the groups of letters that make the smallest breakable down sound, right? Ing, ch, sh, where that sort of becomes more into the phonemic. But then as you get more into phonological awareness has nothing to do with decoding into the written language. So this is my understanding, right? So
interesting.
Like, I mean, that's just sort of like researchy and terms, but you start to see then how complicated it gets when we start telling teachers or we start telling parents like, oh yeah, your child has a phonological processing disorder, right? Like I think if we better understood that, then we would stop trying to fix things on the phonics level. If your child cannot distinguish ch from sh, you know, an r from, you know, t, you know, if, you know, ing from in, then we can stop. Like, if they can't even hear those things, then let's stop trying to, on top of it, add, you know, a written aspect too. Like, very hard for them. And I think it's one of the reasons that a lot of the kids I know who have the phonological processing aspect of dyslexia will have sometimes small speech impediments.
Yes.
Yes, one of my friends, one of my friends who's dyslexic, that's exactly it. She has a tremendously hard time speaking sometimes, almost to the point where it sounds like it's a stutter, but she doesn't have a stutter. It's very fascinating. I think I understand what you're trying to say is why are we teaching them these, I cannot pronounce it, phonemic, is that the word?
Phonemic.
Yeah.
Yes, that's it. If they can't seem to understand it, we clearly have to go at it at a different angle, because if we're just going to keep hitting them on the head with this hammer, they're not going to get it.
And this is interesting because I went to somebody who is a Tomatis listening fitness person. And I don't know if you know about these people, but they think that we can't, read very well because the auditory processing part of our brain is not developed enough. And so they put headphones on and they put, the music is weighted. So one side has the music louder than the other side, and that's supposed to wake up the side that's not doing its job. And I went to see this gentleman and he gave me a wonderful explanation of it, obviously way better than the one I've just given you. But I said to him, but what about perception? Because if your auditory perception is all over the place, then you're not obviously hearing accurately. And if, as you've just said, if you're not hearing accurately, there's no way you can interpret the word accurately. And his reply was, perception. So I'm guessing that the people who study this, perception is not in their study. But I think perception has to happen accurately before the structural part of hearing can happen. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. And I completely agree. And, I have a lot of mixed feelings about some of this because in my research, I run across some different scientists who look at some of this stuff and I feel like I understand less the phonological aspect because once again, it's harder to imagine, but I also see in myself that I have a little bit of the phonological processing disorder. I've always struggled a lot with my vowels because I can't hear the difference when other people speak it. And so, you might say to me, the word is magazine, and I will say magazine, and you say, or this is a famous one. My friends are always trying to teach me to say the word measure. And you'll say to me the way I'm supposed to say it, and I'll say back to you what I hear, which is measure. And so we just come back to the fact, like, this is what I can't hear the differences. So how am I supposed to get it through my brain to make the differences if I can't even hear it? And I heard a scientist talk about you might really want a person with the visual aspects of dyslexia to be your security guard at a location, because people with the visual aspects of dyslexia will walk in, they'll be able to immediately take in a lot of visual information and sort through it incredibly fast to say, oh, over there, that window back there in the second room has a 1-inch crack in it that is different than all the other, windows, which I would never notice because I am not perceptive in that way. And it's a true gift when applied right. Absolutely. And I've heard people talk about the phonological differences just like that. Like there's so many amazing musicians who talk about, many who never learned to read music, who can talk about hearing the sound field and the incredible nuance that exists for them in the sound field. Are they doing something wrong? Or is it just that we're not kind of respecting their gift and figuring out how to use that gift in order to decode or work with human language in a more like approved 2-dimensional way?
No, that's remarkable. All that popped into my head was John Lennon's music teacher told him that he'd never make it because he couldn't read music.
It reminds me of times when I was working in construction or fabricating, and oftentimes they'd say, you have to pay attention to the sound of the blade, and I didn't know what that meant. Like, this blade doesn't make a sound. Yes, it's cutting. So I just found ways to look at whatever I was cutting visually and go, okay, it's cutting properly, or it's not cutting properly, or there's a knot, or I'd pay attention to these things. I always thought people just think in these image-based ways. I never realized that you're somebody different. So if the dyslexic person doesn't even realize it either, how can they explain to others who have no idea what dyslexia is? So there's just a miscommunication in both ways. We have that lag, that barrier that just always seems to sit, and we just think it's always the dyslexic's fault.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to touch on that, because I think this is really the beauty of being dyslexic right now, because there's really an incredible amount of new research coming out about this. Some of it is coming out from the Davis Dyslexia Society. There's a number of scientists who've come out who are like, I am dyslexic, and I believe this is a gift in the realm of science, and I'm going to look at it to help understand this gift. And then there's also people like the author of Proust and the Squid, who's a neuroscientist who had a dyslexic son, and she's like, we cannot just say that this is a disorder. Mm-hmm. Dyslexia is not a disorder. It is a huge cultural gift that has allowed our culture to advance because of it. And reading is not something that we come by naturally. We have manipulated our brains to do this, and our brains are actually changing, and perhaps changing back to a place where reading will no longer be so easy. And I think it's kind of a brilliant time. And I would say that I feel like we're getting all this amazing research to suggest that dyslexia is this incredible gift that is feeding society, that is feeding our ability to think and advance in the ways that we want to think and advance. And yet we still have all of these organizations and schools and just governments who talk about literacy as if it is the fault of the person who has not gotten there.
Exactly.
So it just is just a saying that, Tristan, I think you're completely right. And, it really bothers me when we act like there is something wrong with the person who maybe needs assistance in order to be a fully active citizen, right? Like, why should somebody who struggles with two-dimensional text not be a fantastic teacher, not be a fantastic politician, not be a fantastic citizen in the world, not be a fantastic whatever, right? Musician, et cetera, but yet we always make people feel wrong, like they better go back and study with a tutor to fix what's wrong with them in order to participate better in the world as we've set it up.
Yeah, I think basically the education system can absolve itself of any responsibility if it says that there's something wrong with the person, right?
Yes. And so can the political system, and so can, like lots of other systems, which are basically set up so that if you are one kind of learner, you can participate fully, and if you're everyone else, then you can't. I feel that way. I feel like we're at a place where we actually can start letting go of these old ideas.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you've got a note here about the National Reading Panel, and it's important for parents and educators to understand their research.
Yeah, so there's this thing that I always come across a lot when I'm doing research about dyslexia, or about ways that we figure out how to teach people to read, and I call it the chicken or the egg of phonological awareness. And so what people always say, they're like, okay, well, phonemic awareness, or sometimes they'll be like phonological awareness, or sometimes they'll even get it completely wrong and say phonics, mm-hmm. right? So people are misusing this all the time, but they say, so phonemic awareness is one of the best predictors of how well children will learn to read during the first few years of school. And so, right, we know that phonological awareness, and in particular phonemic awareness, the next level of being able to break it into sounds into their chunks, mm-hmm. is really a fantastic indicator of how easy it'll be for kids to read.
Right. And
because of that, educational systems and educators and everybody else want to jump to, so therefore, we should teach phonics early and often and forever. And if a child has difficulty reading, then we need to give them more phonics more often and for longer.
Yeah.
I get it.
Didn't work for me. I mean,
more of what they couldn't do in the beginning, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so in science and in research, it's very hard to find what is causal, right? I think you and I, most of us, we can look at that sentence, right? Phonological awareness equals easier reading. And we can see that there's a chicken or egg aspect. Oh, perhaps kids who are going to find it easier to read just already find it easier to hear differences in words, right? Like we can see that those two might be related, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're causal, right? So in science, finding what causes something to happen is much harder. Finding correlations is much easier. Oh, it just so happens to correlate that people who can hear differences in words and manipulate those differences easily also find it easier to read. Okay, so why? So often we act like there's no evidence as to what works and what doesn't work around reading. And I think that's largely because people don't want to look at small studies and things like that. But there is this really important bit of research that was done around 2000 called the National Reading Panel. And it was convened in the US, and it was specifically looking at the question of, do we have any evidence as to what actually works to teach kids to read? And like, that sort of seems like an easy question, but they looked at thousands and thousands of bits of research to try to answer this question. And the answer is relatively short. And it's, yes, we do have some evidence as to what kind of programs actually effectively teach kids to read. And would this be a good time for just me to read like the sort of four things that I came up with?
Yeah.
Okay, so they say that a successful reading program will incorporate aspects of 4 strategies. 1, systematic and explicit instruction in alphabetics. Alphabetics means turning speech into print and print back into speech. They look specifically at teaching the letter symbols as well as phonemic awareness and phonics. So phonemic awareness is the sound-spoken word relationship, and phonics is the sound-print relationship, right? So 1, you need to have some systematic and explicit instruction in alphabetics. 2, they want you to have some sort of method to improve fluency. They particularly liked the research on reading done out loud. 3, it helps if teachers have some specific education in reading instruction. Overall, they included that there wasn't enough research to suggest what teachers should be taught, but that they did benefit from explicit instruction of some sort. So 4, there needed to be some attention paid to enhancing reading comprehension. So this means things like implicit and meaningful vocabulary instruction. So what they found was that much of a student's vocabulary will have to be learned in the course of doing things other than just learning vocabulary words, right? They need to be exposed to vocabulary in use, right? Here we're learning how to use a hammer. Look at when we force a nail down, right? So using words in context. They also needed text comprehension instruction. And in this, they had 8 proven methods that count as text comprehension instruction. In brief, these were the reader learning to monitor his own comprehension, readers learning together, readers writing or drawing meanings of what they read, getting help with story structure, teachers supporting or answering questions, the reader getting to generate his or her own questions, summarizing ideas of text, and naturalistic multiple strategy teaching, which is like the super vague idea that seems to cover like just every possible good teaching method.
Right.
And then once again, they mentioned explicit teacher education and how to use comprehension instruction methods. The panel also called for a future study into using computer technology in reading instruction. This was in 2000, so there was actually very little research out there to study around, for instance, computers in the classroom and how these were or were not useful to reading strategies. So that's a lot to take in, but part of what I think was most useful and most interesting in the National Reading Panel was what they discovered did not work. I'd like to talk a little bit more about this because I feel like this is where what I read to you, what I just gave to you is a little bit dense, right? So, and this is me having read the entire huge National Reading Panel recommendations, getting them down to the most specific that they also talk about, but then going back to the full out thing so I could better understand it. I have a lot of background in health research, so I felt like I could do this. And what I found is that it doesn't really appear that anybody ever kind of helps teachers through this, really talks about it in a way that's meaningful to teachers, tutors, learners, parents. But even saying this is what works, systematic and explicit instruction in alphabetics. What does that mean?
Yeah.
Right?
That's what I was just thinking. That's a lot to take in.
And so I started finding that what was really interesting is when they started talking about what the research suggests does not work, because this is a lot more explicit. So one, techniques that work for new learners in kindergarten and grade 1 are not the same as what works for struggling readers, especially after grade 1.
That's interesting.
This kind of gets back to one of the things that Tristan said. Oh, it never worked for me, right? This sort of idea okay, we're going to press home this idea of phonics, right? Or even if you start working with phonemes now, right? Okay, Tristan, cha-cha-cha, C-H, cha-cha-cha, right? You got it? Okay, now we're going to look at it in a word, cha-cha-cha, choo-choo, cha-cha-cha, chicken, right? Okay, so that's wonderful. If that works for you, you're great. You're flying. You're reading. If it doesn't, continuing to work in the same way after grade 1 does not work. You felt it not working as a student, right? But no one listens to students. But we have the foremost research done in North America, and it says their research suggests these same things that they say that work for kindergartners in grade 1 stop working for struggling readers after grade 1.
Do something different.
Do something different.
Yeah.
Okay, specifically, they start getting quite specific. The panel found that phonics-based strategies don't work for older struggling readers, particularly grade 2 and above. If you're an older struggling reader, phonics-based strategies stop working. We already know, right? If they were going to work, they would have worked in kindergarten and grade 1.
When I see students, they're mostly grade 3, grade 4. The wheels have come off by then.
Yes. Okay, so the other thing they say is that phonics-based strategies also do not work for children before kindergarten age who have not yet mastered the alphabet. So I think this is interesting because there is a lot of pressure in North America these days to start teaching kids in these really phonics-based strategies younger and younger.
Way too early.
Way too early. And there's lots of alternative researchers who have said for years, don't do this. If you start associating young children with the idea of right and wrong and learning too young, they stop trying to be creative in their learning process. But we're also just finding that from a basic learning to read, comprehension, sound, whatever thing, if we start getting into phonics-based approaches to learning to read, before kindergarten that we may be causing problems where there wouldn't be ones otherwise.
Interesting.
So, like, I mean, what? This is just huge, right? When you think about this, the largest amount of research ever done into reading, and those same people who commissioned this research to be done have then gone and put funding and resources behind. It's directly, against this. Okay, the panel goes on. There's even more. They say, and I quote, phonics should not become the dominant component in a reading program, neither in the amount of time devoted to it, nor in the significance attached.
How come nobody ever took notice of this?
It's funny that you say that, because the first point where it's the techniques that work for new learners in kindergarten and grade 1 are not the same as what works for struggling readers, especially after grade 1. When you said that to me, that just made me, the first thing that came into my mind was they just think differently.
Yeah.
That's just it. And that's evidence for it. That is a huge thing. It's like, what was it, when you have a little kid and they're playing with the blocks and they're trying to put them in the same shape hole, right? Some of these kids are just differently shaped. And if you have a square, you're not going to be able to put the square in the triangle shape. You're just going to keep bashing it in. And that's exactly what the school system has done. They just keep bashing it in, saying this kid has to learn this way because it's the way we teach, and not thinking we need to reflect.
Yeah. But this is a little bit why I come back to feeling often I feel really bad for teachers. I remember very clearly this woman who must have been at least in her 70s, who I saw go to one of Sue Hall's talks. She'd been her teacher her whole life. She was long retired. She'd just come because she wanted to better understand about something that she had seen through her whole career. And after her talk, she went up and she said to Sue, or this is like what I remember her saying to Sue, she was like, I never understood. And I just kept trying the same things, like with more and more energy. And I just feel awful, right? And it was like, I'm tearing up when I say it, because I think about also those teachers and how they love their students.
Yes.
And they want to do the best thing for them. Mm-hmm. And the more that the students struggle, the harder that teacher is trying to fit that square, shaped student into the circular hole, because all they ever were taught were circles.
Yeah.
The overwhelming response I get from ProDs is, I had no idea. That's the overwhelming response. And I feel for them like you do, because they're going into a classroom with one hand tied behind their backs.
Yeah. And what I don't understand is that phonics is a tool. It is a tool like so many tools in the world. Mm-hmm. Nobody is saying, like, we should not have steak knives. Right? Mm-hmm. We're saying, please stop eating your soup with a steak knife. Right? And so I understand that there's people who feel very attached to what phonics can offer. Mm-hmm. And which is something. Phonics as part of a reading program in kindergarten and grade 1 is completely appropriate. Continuing only emphasizing phonics is devastating. Continuing to emphasize phonics in a struggling learner will ensure that learner does not ever catch up, and likely will spend the rest of their life thinking something is wrong with them, simply because they were taught to eat their soup with a steak knife.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You couldn't have said it better. That's amazing.
Yeah.
Thank you. I think there's something else on your list, though, isn't there?
Well, I mean, this kind of gets me into a perfect thing, which is just like why I wish that people would have access to the tools of Davis dyslexia, particularly teachers, particularly tutors, particularly parents who are left feeling like they're alone to advocate for their children. or as we age and we have to advocate for ourselves, then for learners themselves, because we just need to see that there is another way. Right? We all need to see that there's another way, that actually there's a way that does exactly what this really well-researched and well-intentioned panel that fits within all of their recommendations. It hits every single one. Here is a systematic approach to alphabetics that uses phonemic approaches, but does not solely rely on phonics. It has built-in comprehension strategies. It encourages reading fluency. It includes ways for teachers and tutors and parents to get instruction and mastery of the methods. And it allows the child also to understanding his or her own strengths, gifts, learning strategies and needs. I mean, it couldn't fit better, and it's there and sort of so easy.
It's true. It's true. And it's simple. Simple is profound, right?
It's so simple. It's so profound. And I feel like it's just a simple tool that if more teachers had, then they can make it their own, right? They could figure out how to use it as one of their many tools, right?
It can only expand. Yeah.
Perfect.
Oh, you're amazing. You're absolutely amazing. I wish in a way that we'd filmed this so that people could see the enthusiasm that you have. And it's just remarkable. But I'm sure they'll hear it in your voice. I couldn't be more grateful, because there's no way on earth, being dyslexic, that I would ever read a very long paper on research. It just wouldn't happen. Right? I love the Coles notes, and I'm just so grateful that you have all this energy and this motivation to really research so deeply. It's remarkable. Thank you.
I'm so pleased that my child has led me to get to learn a whole new part of people learning and of the world, and
that's why they're here, that's for sure. I'm just so grateful that you're able to share this with us as well, because I know there'll be people listening to this who will think, oh my gosh, it's fantastic. Thank you.
So I just want to thank both of you. Kristen, it's so fantastic that you're here, that you're doing this, that you encourage Sue in this way, that you're using your gifts to bring more of this to the world. And Sue, there's almost not a day that goes by in my family that someone doesn't basically sing your praises, because I actually cannot imagine my life if we hadn't found you.
Wow. Thank you so very much.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your time.
Amazing, right? So much valuable knowledge to process. Maybe we should ask her for another interview one day. If you have any questions for her or for us, just get in touch. The website is www.thewds.org, and our email address is info@thewds.org. What's next time? Well, we have a young lady who allowed me to take her through a typical interview assessment to see if she has the gift of dyslexia. So, bye for now.